There we go. We're now live across social media, or at least the ones that matter. No TikTok.
Or TikTok.
I have views on TikTok, although I don't know actually. Would they let us do a full Cafe Sci on there? Maybe just a few questions. We'll try it out at some point. But welcome to the latest Cyber Cafe Scientific session, or Cyber Cafe Sci session, with Dr. I
Nat.
do apologise if I'm just Nat Lopez.
Nat is fine.
Is it Nat Lopez or?
Yeah, Nat Lopez.
Yep, Dr. Nat Lopez, all about spectroscopy, which is the interaction of light and matter and involves lasers. So everyone loves lasers, and I'm really looking forward to that. For those of you who haven't attended one of these before, we operate in a webinar format, although at the end there will be an opportunity for more open social discussion. So if you've got a question, if you just put it in the chat window, whether that's a question for Dr. Lopez or for me about any technical issues you might be having, and if the other option is to put it in the Q&A, you will also find there should be a raise hand button, and if you click that at some point, I'll just get in touch through a private chat to talk to you, find out what's going on, what you need, and well, get you sorted out essentially. So without further ado, let me just get that sorted. Right. Beyond that, Cyber Cafe Sci is a replica of what was originally Woking Cafe Sci. Started in a wine bar, moved to an art gallery, and was going to be moving to an Italian coffee shop and another wine bar, actually. And the aim is it's a relaxed environment to have a conversation about science. So while we have a speaker, the speaker can be interrupted at almost any time to ask questions. We can go off at tangents. It's a very informal, open format. So do ask questions, do quiz the speaker, do dig into subjects and ask for clarification as you need. And without further ado, Dr. Lopez, take it away.
Thank you very much. And thank you for having me. I'm very excited to have the opportunity to talk to people about some lasers. Not every day that you can just have some time to talk about lasers. So I am, as James was saying, I'm a laser spectroscopist, which means that I am interested in the interactions between light and matter. Now, just to give you a bit of background about me, I am originally Portuguese. I came to the UK to do my degree, stayed for a PhD, currently a research fellow, still in the UK. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about how I became fascinated with light and matter interaction. So I remember being a kid and thinking about and being a bit mind blown about this idea of, okay, so I'm home and home is in my town and town is in the country in the world in the solar system, Milky Way, and Milky Way in the universe. And where is the universe? This idea that there was no box to put the universe in and that it was infinite really blew my mind. However, as I started going further in my studies, I started looking sort of the exact opposite way, and I started getting really interested about the very tiny particles that are within us, the world around us, our desks, our everything, and how the way those little particles behave, how they really define reality. They define how everything works around us, and the fact that we cannot ever see these tiny particles, but we can have evidence that they're there and we can make things happen. This really blew my mind. So it's like the infinite in reverse from the universe. So that's how I came to study light matter interactions, because that's what spectroscopy is looking for, is for the behavior of these tiny particles. So I like to start every discussion I have, I like to start with defining what we're talking about. And so if we're talking about light matter interactions, let's start with, if my PowerPoint goes. Yeah, let's start with defining what is light. So I suppose that if you're asked what light is, the first encounter or the first reaction you have to light is it's either on or off, right? And it's either lack of light and there's darkness and there's just black, or the light is on and you can see shapes and colors. So on or off. However, we now have known for a long time that light, the light that comes from the sun and from lamps that we call white light, it's more than just white light. We can actually separate it into its constituent part. We can separate it into colors. And so if we put white light through a prism, you can separate it into its colors. And that's because different colors correspond to different wavelengths, and those wavelengths travel differently through at different speeds through the prism, and that's why you can separate them. And this goes to it's related to some wave characteristics of light. So when I say wavelength, so if we imagine light to be a wave like this one here, the wavelength is the distance that goes between those two peaks or those two minima there. And when we talk about the light that we can see, visible light, is comprehended between 400 and 700 nanometers. So between those two, there's something around 400, 700 nanometer distance. But that's what we can see. This visible light is just a tiny little bit of the whole spectrum, which we call the electromagnetic spectrum. And we start with gamma rays, X-rays, there's ultraviolet radiation, which we talk about a lot as well in the context of the radiation we get from the sun. Then visible, then we have infrared, microwaves, radio waves. Each type of radiation interacts with matter in a different way. I am a UV-Vis spectroscopist, an electronic spectroscopist, which means that I work within this sort of region, so visible and ultraviolet. So I have half an hour of stuff prepared for you on this tiny bit of the spectrum. You would need, 5 other experts to talk about the rest. So bear in mind that I'm talking about a small bit of spectroscopy, but spectroscopy is much wider than what we're going to discuss today. So this is if we think about light as a wave, but it is important to think about the fact that light can also have particle characteristics. And so you've sure heard about this idea of a photon. A photon is just a packet of energy, is light as a particle. And all things, prepare to have your minds blown, all things can be either particles or waves. It's just the experiment you're running to observe them. I won't go into that. I just wanted to say that, as a spectroscopist, in the notation that I use to try and bring the photon, the particle, and the wave, this sort of idea together in a drawing, I use a squiggly line. So it's a finite, discrete thing, so like a particle, but squiggly line to represent the wave. So when you see an arrow like that throughout the talk, I'm talking about a photon. That's what it represents. So that's light. What is matter? So, matter is all of the stuff that is around us. And like I was saying in the beginning, matter is...
Sorry, we've just had a question jump in. So how big is a photon? Obviously, they're not actually squiggly lines with an arrow, but what size are they?
So I don't think that we can, when we talk about a particle, of course, that's how I drew it. It's like a sphere. How big is that sphere? I don't think that we can think of a photon as a particle with a size. The particle characteristic of a photon, we are talking about the fact that it's a discrete amount of energy. The sphere is sort of the way that we find to see it in our minds. We imagine a particle is like a ball, but when we call it a particle, we're not saying it's a sphere that bounces about. We are saying that it has a finite, discrete amount of energy. That's what it means, and that it can bounce back when it hits something. That energy, it can bounce back. But I don't think that we can. A photon doesn't have a size. Even when we think about it as a particle, it's not about its size. It's about an amount of energy. I hope that answers the question.
I think it does. If it doesn't, we'll get a follow-up question, so that's fine.
Even though when we start going onto the realms of quantum mechanics, it starts getting a bit weird. Because in the same way, for example, an electron, and I drew electrons in the talk as little spheres. Electrons aren't little spheres. Even though we think about them as particles, they can also be seen as waves, and they aren't really spheres bouncing about. So in the realm of quantum mechanics, we really need to think outside the box, I would say. And on that note, so when we talk about matter, I was just talking about the electrons, and I was talking in the beginning about these very tiny particles that make up everything around us. So we can think about compounds or molecules, but then molecules are made of atoms. And the structure of an atom, most people will be familiar with something that looks a little bit like this. So we've got a nucleus with protons and nucleons, and we'll have electrons orbiting around the nucleus. This is how, and it's kind of like the sun and the planets around. So this is, for example, a sodium atom, and it's useful to think about atoms in this way. But again, with the advent of quantum mechanics, we know that the electrons don't just go around in concentric circles like that. The movement of the electrons around the nucleus is quite chaotic. And the way we describe the movement of the electrons around the nucleus is now in terms of an electronic cloud. So there's an area of space around the nucleus where your electron is going to be moving really crazy, but it's sort of a cloud. It's so quick that it's sort of just an area in space. So it looks something like this. I'll come to this image later in the talk as well. But so in the lowest energy, the most stable, this is for the hydrogen atom, the most stable form of hydrogen atom, there will be this cloud around the nucleus. We've
just had another question, which I think I can answer, which is, what is the red spot? And I was just going to answer, it's the mouse pointer.
I hope that helps instead of being distracting.
It does help once people know what it is, yes.
It's just the laser pointer that I'm using to point at things.
Virtual laser pointer.
Yes. Yes, so like I was saying, the hydrogen atom in its lowest energy, most stable form, the electron around the nucleus is going to occupy the space of a sphere around. If you start going up in energy, these clouds of electronic movement change shapes to more funky shapes, as you see here. And we call these atomic orbitals. So instead of having orbitals that look just like concentric circles, we talk about an area of space where the electron can move. And this is the same for molecules. So a molecule is nothing more than an organized structure made up from atoms. So in this case, this is a molecule that I studied during my PhD. It's just the one I decided to draw, but it's got hydrogen atoms, carbon atoms, nitrogen, oxygen, and you put them all together in an organized structure, that's what makes a molecule. However, where do the electrons go? Like now you have all of these atoms, each one of them comes into it with their own electrons. Where do they go? And there's the same way there were atomic orbitals, we have molecular orbitals. So these blobs here are again the clouds of space where the electrons move. And you can see it's quite interesting that, you know, in this case, the electrons all sort of focus around this ring instead of going for this arm. And
we've just had another question.
Yeah.
Hopefully a quick one. What is the molecule we're looking at? I mean, it's obviously a hydrocarbon, I'm guessing, but is it a particular chemical?
The molecule is called methyl anthranilate, and it's the precursor to well, it used to be a common sunscreen, which is the same thing but with more carbon sort of in this arm here. And as I'll talk about later, I did some work in my PhD with sunscreen molecules, and so I studied this molecule in quite a bit of detail. So that's why it was the first that popped into my mind to put here.
Thank you.
So yeah, so as I was saying, you know, so the electrons will arrange themselves along the molecule in these clouds of space where they can move, and that where the electrons decide to arrange themselves within the space of a molecule is quite important for the properties that the molecule shows, how it interacts with light, what chemistry it does. And being able to simulate exactly what these orbitals look like is some of the work that computational chemists spend a lot of time doing, because this is crucial. Where the electrons arrange themselves in a molecule is crucial, as we will see later. So now we know what light is, we know what matter is. What happens when they meet? So we can start with, so I was talking about before, there's situations where light will hit something and just bounce back. So these are more like physical processes. So you can think of color as a bouncing back mechanism. So if you have, say, a white box and this is your eye, you're looking at it, there's some white light coming in and it comes straight back out, it bounces back, and you see the white light. That's why you see it white, is because you get that radiation into your eye. However, say that you now were to paint the box pink, you applied a pigment, and the pigment is a molecule, and you apply that pigment. When the white light comes in, and let's remember that the white light is constituted of a lot of colors, what is going to happen is that the pigment looks pink, and we see it pink because the pigment reflects pink light, and it absorbs all of the other colors. So this comes back to you may or may not be familiar with the primary colors. So these are the primary colors that an artist or a painter would tell you about. So magenta, yellow, and cyano blue, because they're called subtractive primary colors. They are due to pigments. If we were talking about light itself, so for example, the things that create the pixels on our screens, they actually emit light. So it's not a pigment reflecting light, it's an emission of light. Then the primary colors are red, green, and blue. So in all our screens, all of the colors are made of combinations of red, green, and blue.
Question from George. Is there
Yes?
any such thing as a white photon?
No. White light is a combination of lots of wavelengths, lots of different types of light. So this almost goes to say, or relates to the fact that color doesn't exist. Colors are made by our brains. So some people say that, pink doesn't exist because there isn't a wavelength for pink, or brown doesn't exist because there isn't a wavelength for brown. So there isn't a brown photon. But what you see in your brain is a combination of different types of wavelengths, of different photons of different wavelengths. And those mixtures make the colors that are just your brain interpreting what it receives. So the same thing with white light. We call it white because that's what we see when all the colors get mixed. But in the end of the day, it's just a mix of red, green, and blue, like you see here in the wheel. When you combine those, it looks to us as white, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything photon-wise. Does that answer the question, I think?
It did. We've had another one, which is, could we have a broadband photon?
You can have a broadband pulse or a broadband spectrum. So you can have you can combine so many wavelengths that you end up with. So for example, the light we get from the sun, we see it as white light, but it actually has many photons of many wavelengths, including ultraviolet, visible, infrared, and that's very broad spectrum. And even with lasers, for example, you can generate broad spectrum light, but it's not a single photon, if that makes sense.
I think so. And there's something, your mention of colors not being real, there was something I came across recently, which was this idea that the mix of red and blue, so purple or violet, can't actually be real, because if it was the full spectrum between red and blue, you'd see it as white. So there's no part of the spectrum that really correlates to violet light. I've got no idea if that's true or not. It was just something I came across and was wondering about.
Yeah, so it's funny because pink is my favorite color, and I recently found this very heated debate online about pink not being real, not being a real color, because, like you say, there is no corresponding wavelength to the color pink. I mean, there's no pink in the rainbow, right?
Yeah.
So the color, the wavelength to the color pink doesn't exist. It's just your brain's interpretation to a combination of wavelengths that it receives, and that's how your brain sees it. And that's true for a lot of colors, like brown being the other example. So yeah, color isn't real. Wavelengths are real.
That's not something I'll share with my niece. She'll be very disappointed if pink doesn't exist.
Well, I only found out about this pink thing maybe a couple of years ago, and I was devastated. So, yeah.
That's all the questions for now. Okay. So feel free to devastate us with more colors that don't actually exist.
So I think about color, that's as much as I've got to say. So, there's these like I was saying, these physical processes of radiation or light bouncing back of things. And I mean, reflection in the way we see color is one example. But for example, when, if it's foggy outside and you see light in this sort of haze, what's happening is that light is bouncing off the small particles of water that are in the air that give it that hazy look. So there are physical processes that are just about, light bouncing back of particles of matter. But what I'm really interested in is this bit, the bit that gets absorbed.
Sorry, just Just before we go on to the bit that gets absorbed, I don't think our audience is ready to leave colour yet, and we're branching almost into
dear.
philosophy. So Manpreet wants to know, so no colour is real, or only the ones for which there isn't a specific wavelength?
Well, if you really want to go into the philosophy of it, I mean, how do you know that the red you see is the red I see? All our brains are different. I know what red looks to me, and it seems that for people who are not colorblind, for example, red is a thing that is real, and we can all sort of agree on what red looks like. But there's no guarantee that what I see is what someone else sees, and a colorblind person doesn't see red or blue, or depending on what type of color blindness they have. But so it depends what you interpret as being real or not real. There are certainly colors for which there are defined wavelengths, and then there's others for which there isn't. It depends then what you decide is or isn't real. But that's a very philosophical question.
And actually, this one probably isn't as philosophical as it sounds. When a photon is reflected, is it the same photon?
That is a very good question. And it depends on a lot of things. If it's perfect reflection, it will be the same photon, just different direction. But there are types of they're not reflection, they're called scattering, when a photon hits something and comes back. And sometimes the photon leaves some of the energy with it's you can imagine a game of pool, right? If you have your particle and you have your photon and it hits, that particle is going to get some of the energy, and the photon is going to leave with less energy than what it hit the particle with. So in those cases, I suppose you could say that the photon that comes out is not anymore the same photon that came in, because it's left some of its energy behind. So it really depends on what exactly happens during that interaction. And then we are going on to a whole other field of spectroscopy as well. So yeah, so light matter interactions are an immense field of research. But yes, again, it depends exactly what happens at the point of interaction.
And we've got another one, although this one you might disagree with on a point of principle, that it's far too Anglo-centric anyway. Is colour spelt with a U?
Depends where you are in the world. I mean, where I come from, colour isn't even spelt with an L. It's called cor. So really depends where you come from.
Thank you. I think everyone's ready to move on from colour now. We'll probably come back to it at some point.
Right. So moving away from these physical processes of light bouncing back of stuff and going on to the light that gets absorbed. So the molecules, the particles that make up stuff, they absorb light. And what happens next is what I'm most interested in. So if we stay in color a little bit to talk about vision. So the way you can actually see stuff is because there are light receptors in your eyes. So these receptors, so there's like these big what we call macromolecules. They are massive protein-like shapes. This is not the shape of they're called opsins, these big structures. And this is not even the opsin that's in our eyes, because we still haven't managed to decipher the structure of that. But I'm not so much interested in these big proteins. What I care about is the tiny molecules that are embedded into this bigger molecule that absorb the light. So in the case of our eyes, this is it. It's 11-cis retinal, it's called. And these are called chromophores. So chromophores are the molecules that are embedded into larger structures, and they are the ones that pick the light. In the case of our eyes, this is this is what is picking the light. And what happens is when you photoexcite it, it changes structure. So you see it starts like that, and a photon comes in and it changes structure. And once it changes structure, you can see. So you can imagine that it starts like this, your brain is off, you don't see. And then a photon comes in, the rhodopsin changes shape, and it then triggers the process of bringing that light to your brain, and that's how vision works. So now we're really talking about some light-driven science, right? So now we're talking about molecules that once they absorb radiation, something changes and they trigger processes that are super important, such as vision, but others that I'll talk about later. So in terms of light-driven science in this sense, where particles and molecules and stuff absorbs light, I'm going to divide it into 3 different categories, just because those are the ones that I talk most about, and I may use them interchangeably, not quite correctly, but out of habit I may, so I thought I'd define them. So we have photochemistry. So this is when the light is absorbed and something changes in the molecular structure. So a bond breaks or is made. We have photophysics, where there is an energy, a change in energy state. So I was talking about the orbitals, the electronic orbitals before, atomic and molecular. The absorption of light can make the electron change from one orbital to the other and come back and move around between those orbitals. But the molecular structure itself remains. And so then we call those photophysics. And then we've got photodynamics, which are a combination of photochemistry, photophysics, and other things, like if the molecule just vibrates a bit, that all sort of gets piled up into photodynamics. So if we go on to then the science behind what happens when matter absorbs light, which is really what I find really exciting. So we're back to this idea of an atom nucleus and the orbitals around. And these are the electrons orbiting around the nucleus, like we saw before. When a photon comes in, what happens is that electron gets promoted onto a higher energy orbital. But like we were saying before, the orbitals aren't really these neat circles. So really, if we go back to our atomic orbitals, so remember these are 3D space where the electron can be found. So if you have your electron first moving there, it gets excited by the photon, it goes to a different orbital, and it's now moving in this other space. So that's what happens when an atom receives energy, promotes electrons from one orbital to the other. And again, it's the same for molecules, right? If we keep the atomic case for comparison, and we have now our molecules, you see, this is the lowest energy state, our spherical orbital in our atom, and the ones we calculated to be the lowest energy for the molecule, and then the higher energy orbitals, the more funky ones, that's how they look for this molecule, and like I showed before, for the atom. So we start in the lowest energy state. Here we are, and we put 2 electrons in one orbital. That's the rule, 2 electrons per orbital, and we show them as arrows up and down to talk about spin. Spin up, spin down. They always go paired. That's the rule. So what happens then? A photon comes in, and one of the electrons goes up to the next up orbital. And so now we have excess energy in our molecules, and they are said to be excited. We are now in an excited state. Okay, so the law of conservation of energy tells us that energy cannot be created nor destroyed. It must be conserved or transformed. So we now have these high energy molecules with lots of energy around. They can't just stay up in an excited state forever, because that energy needs to go somewhere. And the question is, what happens to it? Where does it go? So there are processes, these light to light or radiative processes that we know very well. So we've got three cases here, right? And we're talking about the lowest energy state, again, with the two electrons, spin up, spin down is the two arrows. And these are the excited states. So if we take this case first, photon comes in, electron goes up, keeps the spin, and then all it does, spits the photon back out, spits the light back out. And this is something that we know very well. It's fluorescence. So whenever we have, our markers, our high-vis vests, and all fluorescing things, the reason they look like they glow is because once we're out in the sun, they're absorbing light, and then they're spitting the light back out. That's all that's happening. Or there's a different or a second but similar process. Let me play it again. When the photon comes in, the electron gets promoted, but it flips the spin. Now, this flipping the spin is really not favorable. It's not a good thing to happen. So it takes a long time for it to happen, but it still does take place. And again, the same thing. It can just spit the energy back out by spitting a photon, and this we call phosphorescence. And glow sticks, the shiny stars that we put on kids' bedrooms. I mean, kids. I could have some. So that is phosphorescence, and we're very familiar with that as well. And the real difference is just because it is in time. So fluorescence happens faster. Phosphorescence is slower just because there's this flipping of the spin that is not really a good thing, so it takes a bit longer, but that's it. However, there are many processes that we know of where the electron gets photoexcited, it goes to the excited state, and then something happens, the energy gets dissipated. But how? That's the question. What does it do? Where does it go? And that is really, to me, the thing that makes me tickle. Where does energy flow once a molecule is photoexcited? Some of the questions are, does it just produce heat? And heat for some molecules really just means vibration. Heat is vibrations. Or is it transferred to other molecules nearby? And does it excite other molecules to their excited states? And does it then make, does it activate chemical reactions? So in transferring that energy, does it start chemical reactions elsewhere? And for example, in vision, that must be the case because it starts a chain reaction that then helps us see. So that certainly does happen.
We've just had a question in about phosphorescence. So if phosphorescence depends on a photon hitting the atom, how do things phosphoresce in the dark?
It's because it takes so long. So if those little stars, if we kept them in the dark always, they wouldn't phosphoresce. But the thing is that during the day, they are absorbing light from the sun, from the lamps, from everywhere, and then you turn the light off, and that process of emitting the radiation back out is quite delayed, and that's why they keep their glowiness for so long after you turn the lights off, which is why you use phosphorescence stuff in parties and raves, because you want them to phosphoresce for a long time in the dark. So it's quite a delayed process. That's why.
So it's actually storing the energy essentially for hours rather than just milliseconds.
Yeah. So once it gets once it's in, I mean, even if it's just out in the open in a room where lamps are on, it puts all of the molecules in the excited state, and then once you turn the light off, it takes them quite a while for them to actually phosphoresce, which for entertainment purposes is a great thing that it takes so long, because then they glow for a long time.
Thank you.
Welcome. And so yeah, so this idea of where does the energy go is an active field of research with lots of applications and implications that I will tell you a little bit about. I can't cover everything, but if we start with the case of sunscreens, which, like I was saying, was my PhD. I have here an example of a molecule that was studied by Louis Baker. It was a PhD at the same time as me, and he had a very good example of what a sunscreen should do in terms of its photodynamics. So this is oxybenzone. It's quite a common sunscreen ingredient, and once you photoexcite it gets, it's full of energy, it's excited. After a while, it loses some of its energy. And the way it does that is it just shakes it off. It just finds ways to redistribute that energy into vibrations of the molecule without breaking. And it eventually keeps shaking it off until it's back where it started. Now, this is precisely what you want a sunscreen to do. You want it to dissipate that excess energy quickly. So you don't want that energy to go anywhere else to start creating chemical reactions in your skin or anything.
Sorry, just before we jump a bit more into sunscreen on phosphorescence still, from Manpreet, can it phosphoresce as in emit light only in the dark, or does it phosphoresce during the day as well if it's fully charged, as it were, or it's had enough energy for long enough?
It's always going to be phosphorescing, but it's more visible in the dark just because phosphorescence is quite weak in terms of the intensity of the light. So you might not notice it while you have it out, just because the light you're getting from elsewhere is much more than what you're getting from your phosphorescent thing. But so it will always be phosphorescing for sure, because so kind of the same thing with what I was talking about with this molecule. As long as it's exposed to radiation, it keeps absorbing photons and emitting photons. Not this one, the phosphorescent one. Absorbs and emits, absorbs and emits, and it keeps doing that. It doesn't matter if as long as there's photons, it's going to absorb them. And as long as it's in the excited state, it's going to start working to get out of the excited state. It's just the case that you see it better in the dark because you have more contrast to see the emitted light, if that makes sense.
Thank you. And back onto sunscreen. Do the sunscreen vibrations cause heat? So sunscreen would actually heat you up?
Yes, and this is something I have, because so when I started my PhD, I was thinking, well, okay, they vibrate, but it's not like they're going to actually heat you up. I mean, you put sunscreen on and you don't feel anything. So, we're talking about less than microscopic vibrations. And in science terms, you call that heat, but heat at a quantum level is quite a different thing from macroscopic heat. And then there was a point where I was trying to be like, okay, well, but let's try and do the calculation of how many molecules in a single, I don't know, blob of sunscreen would you need to actually feel any heat? And I could never really quite come up with the way to theoretically get to this number. But then I moved on to a different project, still working with sunscreens, but to actually gather the heat that it's formed. And someone actually just tried, have a surface, put some sunscreen, put a UV lamp on it, and look at it with a heat camera. And they found that just some commercial sunscreen over, I think it was over a few hours, I think 2 hours, I can't remember now exactly, but it does increase the temperature of the surface by about a degree. So it does create macroscopic heat. And that surprised even me, but the answer is yes. You are unlikely to notice it once you apply it and go to the beach. But it does produce actual heat that we in a macroscopic world understand as heat. I think that's fascinating, but yes, it does.
Well, I don't do well with heat, so I'm never wearing sun cream again.
You should. You definitely should. It's only a degree, so it'll be fine.
Thank you. That's it for questions so far.
Right. So back to the sunscreen. So this is the idea, like we've been talking about, that once it absorbs the photon, it absorbs the energy. You'd want it to be dissipated as heat. And also we've got this idea of the sunscreen being recycled, right? So it undergoes this cycle. So it absorbs a photon, does what it needs to do, is back, and now it's ready to absorb a photon again. So if we could make all sunscreens do this cycle indefinitely, your sunscreen wouldn't degrade with time. And right now you should always reapply, even if you don't go into the water. You should always apply sunscreen every 2 hours or so, because after it absorbs radiation, it's going to degrade. But if we could make this a perfect cycle and recycle that molecule, it would always be ready to absorb more. And the last thing we would like, from a photophysical point of view, we don't want any reactive photoproducts. So we don't want this molecule to be breaking apart, because what it breaks apart into is going to have different properties and it could be harmful. And in fact, oxybenzone does have a little bit of a photoproduct. It's not major, it's like 10%. It's quite acceptable. The big problem with oxybenzone is not so much what it does to you, is what it does to coral reefs. So you may have heard that Hawaii, Palau, and some other places around the world are banning sunscreen use, particularly use of sunscreens that contain oxybenzone, because it has been shown to kill corals. So that's the big problem with oxybenzone. So photophysically, great. Environmentally, not great. So the idea is to keep looking at other things, finding other things that are photophysically great, but also environmentally great.
Back to that heat, just quickly. Mm-hmm. Does it get emitted as infrared?
Yes. So heat, vibrations, infrared radiation are almost all different ways to say the same thing. So even what infrared radiation does to a molecule is make it vibrate. And infrared radiation is detected when something is hot, which means that its particles are going to be vibrating. So they're almost interchangeable terms. So yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions for now?
Not for now.
Okay. So really what we want these sunscreens to do is to shake off the extra energy as heat. And we have found in the group where I did my PhD, found plenty of examples, and we're still working on more and better things that dissipate its energy as heat. And there's always some molecular motion that allows for that dissipation of energy. And I wanted to give an example that Emily Holt worked on recently that hit the news. And not every day that you see sunscreen photophysics make the news, but Emily and Mitch and our supervisor Vas, they published a paper with some collaborators on this molecule, this sunscreen, that the motion that it uses to dissipate the energy is, like Emily described, is like flamenco dancing. It's sort of a rotation like that, and the terminology flamenco dancing really resonated with the news, and so it made the news, and I thought it was a good example to show there. But so this is sunscreens. They absorb energy, dissipate as heat. That's one thing that may happen. However, there's much more complex energy transfer mechanisms that are very important to the world around us. And this is really where the action takes place, and what I think is really fascinating. So I am going to leave you with a video once it starts. So this is about photosynthesis, and I just wanted to give you an idea of what I mean by energy transfer. And I'll say a few things after. So I'll leave you for 2.5 minutes. I'll leave you with this.
Soaking up energy from sunlight, plants and algae generate the oxygen in the air you breathe and turn your carbon dioxide waste into food and fuel. In the green plants you see around you, most photosynthesis chemical reactions happen inside leaf cells. Inside those cells, specialized organelles called chloroplasts absorb photons across folded-up membranes. Resembling stacks of coins inside the chloroplasts, thylakoid membranes are where photosynthesis light-dependent reactions occur. Spread across the thylakoid membrane are vast arrays of proteins and pigment molecules that can capture photons and convert light energy into chemical energy. The photon capture system is formed out of precisely arranged chlorophyll pigment molecules. Chlorophyll can absorb the energy of a blue or red photon and pass the energy via a quantum mechanical effect through a chain of pigment molecules to a photosystem to reaction center. The two molecules at the bottom of the reaction center are a chlorophyll special pair. Together, they can use the energy from an absorbed photon to energize an electron and release it up through a chain of acceptor molecules. At the top of the reaction chain, 2 electrons are accepted by a quinone molecule, which then ferries the energy to other steps in photosynthesis. The loss of an electron by the chlorophyll special pair results in a positive charge because of the missing electron. To replace this lost electron, a nearby cluster of manganese and calcium ions are able to generate electrons by splitting water molecules. Removing 4 electrons from 2 molecules of water generates a molecule of oxygen and 4 protons. A leaf absorbs more than 10 quadrillion photons each second. The energy from those photons powers photosynthesis, maintaining the oxygen you breathe and producing food and fuel for the living biomass of our planet.
Right, so you saw those bits where there's this light that goes from one place to the other. That is the stuff of my professional dreams. That is really what I want to know about. And you can see that, like the video was saying, this fantastic phenomenon of producing fuel and from just carbon dioxide and light is it's absolutely staggering. And photons initiate that, and all that amount of chemistry that you saw is initiated by photons. However, and we know that these energy transfer processes happen, these cute lights that they put bouncing from one thing to the other, we know they happen, but we don't know why. Why does the energy go that way and not another? You know, how does it decide where to go? And testament to the fact that we don't know is that we cannot mimic photosynthesis yet. We've been trying, because if we could mimic photosynthesis, you know, we'd solve the energy problem, right? Because we just get CO2 from the air, we get light that we just get from the sun, and we produce energy. And we've been trying with solar energy, photovoltaics, but we cannot mimic photosynthesis exactly, and we can only produce energy from the sun with relatively low efficiency when we compare it to photosynthesis. Now, if we could understand why, so these energy transfer mechanisms, they are just electrons moving around, bouncing from, you know, one molecule to the other. If we could understand why an electron decides to move where it wants to move, if we could control it, if we could make it go where we want it to go at the speeds and at the time we want it to go, then we could control these processes and make them work for us. And I mean, again, that's the stuff of my professional dreams. And for example, in sunscreens, we don't want these energy transfer processes to happen. So if we understand them, we can also stop them when they're harmful. So, you know, this is, I went to a conference a couple of years ago that was 3 days full of discussion, and all we talked about was this. And we all came out of it with more questions than answers. It's such a wide, prolific, brilliantly complex field of research. So this is what makes me tick. And so how do we study these things? So these things happen real fast, in femtoseconds, which is 0.14 zeros and 1 second, is real fast. That's the sort of time scale that a molecular bond is made or broken is in about this time scale. So we use ultra-fast laser spectroscopy to follow these fast energy transfer, energy redistribution processes, and we use pump-probe techniques, which is sort of it's the concept of stop motion, really. So it's this stop motion approach to photodynamics. So if I show you this clip, you are probably familiar with it. From the film Chicken Run, which is quite famously a stop motion film. So, you know, this dynamical event of the chicken dancing is made by lots and lots of static shots of the chicken like this, like this, like this, like this, and then you put them together and you make the dynamic event. It's the same sort of idea. It's not new. So in 1878, there was an experiment run to try and see if at any point during a horse's gallop, the horse had all 4 legs off the ground. And so what did they do? They got a really fast, or the fastest they had, a fast camera, got the horse galloping, took pictures of it, and they could see the motion. Now, if you could take each bit, each photo and put them all next to each other, you could make essentially a video of the horse's gallop. So stop motion, this idea of stop motion, it recreates movement by taking several pictures, and so does this idea of pump probe laser spectroscopy. It recreates the molecular dynamics by taking pictures, and I should say pictures, they're not actual pictures, but it's the same sort of idea. So we take pictures of the excited state of the molecule to follow its dynamics. So in more sciencey terms, what that means is that, so if we've got a ground state, so that's the lowest energy state that I was talking about before, the most stable state of our system, molecular atom, usually molecules, that's where our electrons are. That's our population, electronic population. Then we have an excited state. So that's the state where our photon puts our population. And then there's a state where there's a detectable signal. That depends on the experiment. That's just the point at which you detect something. And so we have a plot of amount of signal you get from your excited state with time. So initially, there is no population in your excited state. So you can try and probe from there, but you have nothing. So you have minimum signal. And as long as there's no population there, you have minimum signal. And that keeps happening. However, you pump your sample, it goes up to the excited state. Now you have all of your population in your excited state. So you probe it again, and now you have all of your population here, so you have maximum signal. However, with time, like we said, the excited state is not going to live forever because the energy needs to go somewhere. And so that those electrons, that population is going to start going somewhere else. And as it does, we have less population here, we have less signal. Some more decays, we have less population still, and we have less signal, and so on and so forth, until we are back at being there, no population in the excited state, And so we have minimum signal again. And then what we can do is we fit a line to this, and we use mathematical models to see then how long it takes for this excited state to decay back to where it started. So that's the general idea of the experiments we run. This is how experimentally the lab works. I'm not going to go through all of that, but that's just a forest of optics. There's mirrors, there's lenses, there's lots of things, and there are laser beams just through all of those optics until they meet the sample and they run the experiments. So at sample, the sample is usually held somewhere here, and at sample we have a flow cell like this, and we have liquid sample going in from the bottom and up. So there's a little film of liquid that is sandwiched between two windows, and so there's our sample. So let's say we're studying methylanthranilate, that molecule I showed initially. There's our molecule. Then a laser beam comes through your pump, and so now your molecule is photoexcited. And then you have your probe, and you take the picture. So the first probe takes the picture there. After a while, the molecule moves a bit, and you take another picture with the probe again. And after another while, it moved again, and you probe it again. You take another picture, and you repeat this many times until you can have an idea of what the molecule is doing. So that's sort of the idea behind this type of experiment, and I can talk more about it, but that's sort of the approach.
We've got a few questions which have come in, but I'm just going to say I'm rather astounded by the idea that you're just taking stop motion pictures of a molecule.
It's like you're working for Chicken Run. It's great.
But anyway, the questions. So Michael wanted to say, is it correct that the sunscreen molecule absorbs the UV photons and expels the energy as IR photons in heat, and in doing so changes the frequency and obviously the wavelength of the light?
That is an excellent question. I suppose yes, in a way, because again, photons, if we think them about as waves, yes, you can say that a molecule will absorb a wave of UV energies, and then it emits waves of IR energies. Yes, I think that's correct to say. And we all do it, right? Our bodies emit IR, so it's IR radiation. They're IR waves, and they come from our vibrations. So yes, I suppose that's correct.
And also from George and Barbara, does the detector affect the excitable state?
It will. The type of detector you have will define what it is you're looking at. So, for example, in the lab at Warwick, we actually have two experiments. So we have a gas phase experiment and we have a solution phase experiment. In the gas phase, what you're looking at are so your probe ionizes your excited state. So you're looking at ions coming through. In the solution phase, we are looking at the amount of light that gets transmitted through the sample. So you are measuring different things, and therefore the assumptions you can make or the way you can interpret your data is different, because it tells you different things. And it's important to keep that in mind when you're interpreting your data. So it's not so much that the detector is it's not so much that the detector is influencing what happens at sample. It's not so much of a quantum mechanics observation changes the sample sort of thing, but it is that the way you mount your experiment, the way that the thing that you decide to observe is going to have implications in how you interpret your data. I hope that answers the question.
George, Barbara, does that answer the question, or do you want to? It may take a minute to actually get a new question through, so if you want to carry on while we wait for the response.
Yes, I mean, I am very nearly done. So I sort of just wanted to introduce this idea of ultra-fast time-resolved spectroscopy, this sort of experiments, and how they can be used, and just give you some examples or applications of things in which this is important. And they're really just examples that popped into my mind. There's so many others. There's so many people using this sort of technique to study all sorts of things. But so I mean, one of the implications is skin cancer and damage to DNA. So, you know, we all have heard in some form, every time we go outside, UV radiation is absorbed by the DNA in our skin, and UV is actually energetic enough to break those molecules apart, and that's how DNA damage happens, and that's sort of the starting point for skin cancer. So understanding how DNA reacts to light, it's important. And then there's sort of the thing that goes with it, the sunscreens, like I was talking to you about, how the sunscreens themselves react to light, and also you know, how they react within a formulation and on the skin. So, you know, does being applied on the skin change the photodynamics or not, things like that. But there's other things more mundane probably, so like paints and coatings and everything that is a pigment, it's absorbing light, and therefore there will always be some amount of pigment that undergoes chemical reactions after it gets excited by a photon, and that's really what makes sun damage in cars, in car paint, for example. So you know, paint manufacturers are interested as well in understanding how light affects these pigments. But then again, like I was saying, we've got this this energy problem that we need to solve, and photovoltaics and solar energy are again a very active field of research right now. And being able to mimic photosynthesis is, I would say, the holy grail of energy transfer scientists, if I could make such a bold statement. But then UV light can also be used in a more what perhaps you think about when you think about chemistry, chemical reactions and pharma and things like that. So sometimes to make a reaction take place, you need to excite your molecules, and they use light as well. But another thing that I have been thinking about a lot, and I don't know how much this is known in general, is this idea of photodynamic therapy as cancer treatment. So one of the problems with cancer treatments right now is that you take a drug and it's going to attack cells all over the body. That's why you lose hair, that's why you get nausea. It's because those drugs are they're not very selective. It's very, very difficult, almost impossible to make them selective in the way we'd like them to be. And so the idea of photodynamic therapy is that you'd find a drug that is not active as you take it. So it spreads through the body, but it does nothing. It only does something against the cancer once you activate it with light. So imagine I have skin cancer in my arm. I take, well, even though skin cancer, the first thing you do is cut it off. But let's imagine that I've got skin cancer that for whatever reason cannot be cut off. You take the drug, it goes all throughout your body, it's in your system, but it's inactive. And then you point light at the site of the cancer, and you can selectively activate the drug so that it is only active, it is only toxic against cells at that site. And so you make cancer drugs much more selective. So this is one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about, and another example of how light matter interactions can be very interesting. Few examples. So I am essentially finished. I just wanted to say that I hope I managed to get you a little bit excited about electrons and their movement, and thinking about how electrons choose to move in stuff around us and in our own bodies is what makes the world what the world is. And that's a fascinating, mind-blowing thought that has kept me going this far in my scientific career, and I hope I managed to get that across. And then finally, I just wanted to have a small moment of thanks to the institutions where I've been in the UK during my academic career, but mostly to the people. So I've been at the University of Warwick for 6 years now, and that's the research group that I looked like that when I started in 2014. It now much more recently looks like this, and yeah, I believe this is me done. I'm very happy to take more questions.
Yeah, I was going to say you think you're done, but unfortunately you seem to have excited people, pardon the pun.
Yeah.
So I'm sure there will be a few questions, but so now's your chance to ask questions, everyone, before we go offline, and that includes people on Twitch, Facebook, wherever you might be watching. So if you have them, type them in. But I just want to say a huge thank you for that. It was absolutely fascinating. As you can see from the questions you were asked and answered, people are interested in it and interested in the excitement around it. And we have got a question coming in now, which is, what got you interested in this area? Because you mentioned at the beginning about the universe and then going the other way down to fundamental particles, but how did those two merge into giving you laser spectroscopy?
I think it's sort of an accumulation of things, right? I mean, in school, when I started thinking about atoms and electrons and things, I was very I was fascinated by it, and by this idea that we have tiny little things in our bodies that move all the time, and that essentially decide. I mean, because even, you know, the fact we eat and we get energy out of the food, like all of that is how chemistry decides to happen. And how chemistry decides to happen is where electrons decide to move. So, you know, that sort of stuck with me. And I ended up doing chemistry, a chemistry degree at Leicester. And during that, I realized that, you know, the physical side of chemistry, where chemistry and physics meet, that's where I wanted to be, and studying these small particles and how they behave and why. And then I did, for my third year at university, I did a placement at the Science and Technology Facilities Council down in Didcot. And I was, for the first time, I was using lasers and doing laser spectroscopy. And I was absolutely fascinated. I mean, that experience, I think, was really what, it was the opportunity to being exposed to a laser lab that really clicked it in my mind that that's what I wanted to do. And it hasn't died off since. So here I am.
I feel you need to make more jokes about being excited by lasers. But another question we've got in, can you envisage treatments for photosensitive skin disorders such as vitiligo?
So I know there's actually, so the cosmetic industry, well, actually they look at both things to darken your skin and lighten your skin. But I wonder, because the vitiligo, I think it's a lack of melanin in the skin. So there are areas of the skin where your body just doesn't express the pigment. So I don't think you could use light to trigger that, because the problem is precisely that your body doesn't respond to trigger that melanin, as far as I understand. So I don't think light could be used in that way, but I know that in terms of using chemicals to darken the skin, that is done. Yes.
And George and Barbara are asking, what's the mechanism by which light is transformed into kinetic energy by a light sail or one of those little light mill devices that are always really strange to watch?
I don't know that I know one of those.
They're little ones with a sort of weather vane inside, very low air pressure, painted white on one side, black on the other.
I don't actually know the science behind that, but I mean, so light is energy, and kinetic energy is exactly that. So it's I don't know if that's how those things in particular work, but you could envisage is again one of those problems with the pool, right? You've got two balls, one is static. As long as the other one has energy and it hits the other one, and then the other one is in movement, that's a photon giving a particle kinetic energy. It's making it move. So you can envisage a process like that.
Yeah. So because the photon has direction, it must have energy in that direction. If it gets stopped, it's transferring that energy. Okay. If you're quickly typing out a question to get in before we, never mind. In scattering, how is the direction of the emitted photon determined?
I think, don't quote me on this, but it just follows vectors, vector laws or rules, if you want. So it depends on the direction at which it hits it. But it depends if it's elastic scattering or inelastic scattering as well. And I'd need to go read my books again to be able to talk to you about that.
Okay. So yeah, if that's all of the questions, then I'm going to bring us off the live broadcast. And Nat, if you're happy to stick around for a bit, then anyone who wants to, I'll just bring onto the panel to have a more general casual discussion. I understand completely if you just want to get away and relax now, because I know it is quite hard work.
I will stay for a little bit. I still have a little bit one, so I'll stay till that's done.
Okay, so for everyone watching at home and not in our interactive live Zoom studio, I really need to come up with better terminology there. We hope you've enjoyed it. As always, get in touch, talk to us, and good night. And for everyone else,